This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the Gem City of Dayton, Ohio. As a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network, we are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs by providing the best customer service and world-class workshops. Visit CornellStudioSupply.com for 20% off the largest ceramic book selection of all time. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters by potters.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 537 of the podcast, and welcome back to our first episode of 2025. Today I'm talking with PJ Anderson about her figurative sculptures and vessels, which have a rich patina created through multi-day smoke firings. I was honored to have her in the complete guide to low-fire glazes for potters and sculptors, and in our interview today we talk about her making process, the influence of sci-fi futurism, and how she teaches students to understand the difference between cultural transmission and appropriation. We also discuss her work in community engagement for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, and how maintaining archives address the realities of the past. I did want to give a trigger warning. At about 40 minutes or so in this recording, we start to talk about her work for the center, and it's a heavy topic, so I just wanted to make you aware of that as you're listening. If you'd like to see examples of her work, you can follow her on Instagram at PJ Anderson Ceramics. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Let's start talking about your figural work, and I wanted to thank you for being a part of my book. I really appreciate you being a part of it. And there's this beautiful figure that you submitted for it, and it is a life-size figure, and it's a sci-fi figure with a full armor that is smoke-fired. So it's pretty amazing that you did this. So can you talk a little bit about that work?
That one is my backlash figurine. It took me about 11 months to put together. For process, it was sort of an adventure. I was attending the University of Manitoba. And when I did my undergrad at the University of Manitoba, we had these three beautiful train car kilns that were gigantic, spectacular, wonderful. They got shut down because of the air violations that have been changed. And so they had to tear down our entire ductwork and rewire it and buy commercial ones and have those installed and have everybody approved. So long story short, there has not been a gas kiln at the University of Manitoba since 2019. It's still not fixed, FYI. So I originally had planned to make these one whole piece and fire them in this beautiful, wonderful kiln that we used to have. But since I couldn't, I had to use our electrics. And they weren't gigantic. They weren't big enough. So I had to build everything modular. So I would build one piece. I could fire it. And then I had to build the next piece on top, making the adjustments for the size of the drying and firing. make sure that it would still fit once it was fired. So I did, there's the leg pieces. Well, there's the feet, the legs, the waist, the upper chest, shoulders, each arm, and the head. And all of those are separate pieces that had to be attached later on. It was bananas. It was bananas. I'm actually really, everyone's like, oh, it's beautiful. It's so big. I'm really impressed at how well everything fit together. They're like, and like the math on that, like, give me the degree for just the math. Oh my God. No one really knows outside of ceramics people how difficult that is, but it worked and it stood freestanding. It was solid. So
wow.
That was my adventure.
And so it took 11 months, but this was your MFA work, right?
It was my MFA work, yeah.
Is it a 2-year program?
It's a 2-year program. And the first year I started doing figurative work in my first year because it was something key. I don't know if this is a you thing, but before I went to grad school, I had a basement studio in an 8x10 bedroom with my kiln in the garage. And you're not going to make like 6-foot sculptural figures in your basement studio. Like that's just not a thing you're going to do. You're going to make something that you hope somebody buys so you can buy more clay to justify the fact that you have all of this in your house. So I was like, all right, I'm going to do something stupid, something I would absolutely never do in my regular practice, because when am I going to be able to do this again? This is the point of grad school, is to do something ridiculous and absolutely unreasonable in real life. So figurative sculpture is what I did, life-size figurative sculpture. I just wanted to try it, see what would happen. So the first part was finding a clay body that I liked, trying out all my terraceges, my slips, and seeing how those worked, setting up smoke firing kilns and barrels, getting all of that done. Seeing how big I could make something, or really how small, or like what kind of manipulations. One of the figures that I did had an outfit that was made from tiny little squares of clay that I strung together afterward and made like a dress. That was also bananas, but I did it anyway, just to try out and see what it would look like. My first year was pretty much trying everything out. The second year was, okay, this is the drawings that I have made. This is what I'm going to attempt now and see how it goes.
Physically, the reference, it has a sci-fi reference. Like the face is not like a stormtrooper, but people would recognize sectional armor in the same way that like a stormtrooper or some type of sci-fi character would have what appears to be futuristic armor. But there's this really interesting blend. Like you're using a process that, at least in North America, in terms of smoke firing, is considered to be traditional. I'm putting that in quotes because it's actually super contemporary, but it is a quote unquote traditional process with a sci-fi subject matter that is very much future looking. So can you kind of talk about that push and pull in the timeline?
When I started clay undergrad, when I was a baby potter, doing things that had anything to do with traditional ceramics wasn't a thing in higher ed. Like, absolutely not. All my teachers, except for one, were high fire, porcelain, gas kilns, wood fire, temakus, Shinos. Oh God, save me from Shinos. But like, it was awesome and I love it. But I didn't really want to do that with my own work. Like, you have to learn these things because you're in secondary school and it's your job to learn how to make glazes, whether you use them or not, right? You need that education. But I really wanted to learn about how Indigenous Canadians were, the people that lived where I did, were making pots. And I wanted to learn how, people in Africa were making pots and the Caribbean were making pots. So that was my main goal, was to learn these particular skills. And as I got into grad school, they started working towards my, Afro-Indigi futuristic futurescape sort of work. I really liked the idea of taking the thing that kind of made me the unpopular kid in clay, the weird clay kid who did the thing that nobody else was doing. and using that to talk about digital space in the future. So I'm using like the oldest of human technologies, like, and using that to talk about the most current of human technologies and using them to fight with each other. Like, are we really any different from the people who invented this, even though we're now fighting wars in digital spaces, you know? Yeah. So that was my thought process throughout the whole thing. I thought it was kind of funny using ancient technology to talk about future things.
Well, you said on a panel about sci-fi a couple years ago in Sika that was a part of the Shot Callers in the Kiln Sitters. It was like a dual podcast recording, and you said something that was interesting, that in digital spaces that you have created multiple personas or avatars that move within those spaces because there are societal ramifications. If you're in, like, let's say a Marvel fan club online, like Reddit or something, if people realize that you're a Black woman, you're treated differently than if they think that you're, I don't know what they think, but you know, that there is some baggage that people bring to the digital space that they also have in the physical space.
They do a lot. It's a huge thing. It's a huge thing. And I really like the idea of being able to try on, or really not an idea. We do it. We all do it. It's ubiquitous. Everybody does it. I'm not special. But being able to put on different aspects of your personality in different spaces, like adapting to that space in order to be able to interact. And in digital space just happens to be one where you can pretend to be not a Black woman interested in science fiction and fantasy, or you can pretend to be really whatever you want to be that makes it okay for you to use that space. There's like this theory or assumption with a lot of people that because you're a minority of some kind, that you're always available to debate the right of your existence at any point. Like at parties, people will be like, so can you explain racism to me and why I should care? I'm not a party, dude. Like, Google it. I don't know. What do you have? But there's really an expectation that at all times I will be like ready to have these debates about why I deserve to exist, or why, you know, gay people deserve to exist, or why women deserve rights. And sometimes it's exhausting. And sometimes, I mean, it's always exhausting. When I was younger, I used to really, I don't know if enjoy is the word, but I used to really get something out of those debates, those arguments, and trying to change minds. I don't think I ever did, but I really got something out of it. And now that I'm grown, it's like, I'm tired. Like, I don't want to do this thing. I just want to like the things that I like in the window of time that I can like them. And sometimes it's just easier and safer to do that under these personas and guises.
When you talked about that from the podium, I was in the back recording it and I'm watching the audience, and a young woman heard you say that. And I could tell by the look on her face, like, oh, I never realized I could do. In fact, I think she even commented, like, I didn't realize I could do that. This is a great idea. And it's sad that needs to happen, but that discussion empowered her to change her digital experience. And I think actually your art does the same thing. Like the piece that you made, is it Lady Liberty? What's the...
Yeah, the story of Liberté, the Liberté sculpture. Yeah,
exactly. And the idea that this sculpture was embodying this fight or this struggle in the digital space, but you're making a 3D sculpture. So can you talk a little bit more about that piece? Because it uses some similar techniques, but it is a different vibe than the one of the full armor.
Yeah, the Liberté piece is really, really fun in a lot of ways. That one was made sort of as a response, because at the time, France was rioting. They love to riot. Oh my gosh, they're great at it. They're so good at rioting. But the police had killed a Black man in Paris, I believe it was. I can't remember the specifics of it because I don't remember things. But the French people lost their collective minds about it. Like, they were just like, absolutely not. Like, this is unacceptable. And they were like burning police cars, and they were like throwing rocks. And as I was watching this unfold in my head, I'm like, okay, so we have a nation that was built on colonialism, that spent a lot of time liberating objects and money from these African countries, who then somewhat treated the people who emigrated there from those countries poorly for several hundred years. But they drew the line at police brutality, and that was absolutely a no-go. Like, you guys are so complicated, and I love this. Like, their relationship with rights, human rights, is just so fantastically weird from a Canadian point of view. And we all have our own weirdness, right? Each one of our nations have these things, these hills that we will absolutely die on. And that was theirs. So that Liberté character really came from that. It's based on the Delacroix painting, Liberty leading the people, it's got her like blue out and everything, the flag. So that was what it was leaning towards when I started doing it. But because it was about a Black man, I thought that it was even more interesting to make it about a Black woman. So use the Black woman as representation of that liberté and what that actually means and what you're fighting for and where your lines are. So that was the point of that piece. I really enjoyed doing it. She had dreadlocks, and I used actual wool to like dread her hair. It took me hours. Hours.
You had said in a talk you did with Sequoia Miller, there's a great series online, 3 Things, that was done during the pandemic. You said something that I thought was interesting, is that smoke firing is actually one of the most practiced ceramic processes globally. Like, there's still tons of people making work that way that are firing what we would consider like an outdoor, like a pit firing or some type of reduction firing with a combustible material. But in North America, that's seen as a traditional technique. So can you talk just a little bit about sort of the history of that process, but then also how we categorize things? Because like, say, slip casting is never seen as traditional, even though slip casting, you can look at hundreds of years old slip cast things. But then smoke firing, which people are doing right now all over the world, is seen as traditional. So can you talk a little bit about that?
All the people that are doing traditional firings, quote unquote, tend to be people from poor countries, brown and poor. People that don't tend to have more money, more money to spend on other things. I hate to break it down like that, but yeah, if you look, you're talking about South Asia, you're talking about Africa, Central and South America, like Americas, amongst Indigenous people. All of those places where those kinds of firings are done, they tend to be economically disadvantaged on a global scale. And it's still worth it for them to be using traditional methods to make ceramic pieces rather than go to a Walmart or a store. And like, this is a really fun idea or concept to think about. Ceramics is incredibly labor intensive. We are all know that. But going and digging your clay, processing your clay, mixing it, making your piece, firing your piece, and using your piece, like, that's a huge amount of effort that you're making for something that is essentially like terracotta. It's going to fall apart eventually, right? It's not strong. It's not going to last forever. It has to be economically worth it for them to do that and not go to Walmart. So that means they can't afford Walmart. But they can afford to go and get their own clay and dig their own clay and make their own slip. And they can afford to harvest cow dung or grasses or woods in their area in order to fire it. Those techniques that we still have, they're pretty much still there because the people that are using them are much less economically advantaged than the rest of us.
I think a lot about the process. It also doesn't fit into the hygienic way that a lot of universities want to approach things. And I think that's why it's not always in academia. Why don't we go through your process of how you do smoke firing? And then I want the listener to think about what this smells like in the kiln yard relative to the nice electric kiln that you push the button and walk away.
Well, I do a bit of cheating, especially with my thesis work. So they're all bisque fired already, but they're usually bisque fired to like own one for any of the sculptures, but any of my vessels, they're usually fired to O10. So they're low because they're burnished. So I will bisque my piece, and then I will collect my sawdust, so my woods. I have a couple of carpenters that have the very, very, very fine sawdust that I'm really looking for that are willing to hand over to me. There's a couple of woodworkers around the city that I've also befriended who are able to give me different kinds of woods, hardwood, softwood, all sorts of things. So like I have a bunch of different things to choose from. I also like to add some organic material, different kinds of oxides. A bunch of different things that add different colors as they off-gas or whatnot. And then I set it alight and I let it burn smokily for 3 days or so. It's really, really fine sawdust. That's the good stuff.
Wow.
So the longer it burns, oh yeah. If you pack in the really fine sawdust really well, beautiful results. The looser it is, the dirtier it looks. I don't know if that's a way to say it. It's just sort of an overall smokiness. But the more it's packed in with the finer sawdust, the more you get those really blacks in the reduction part, and you get these beautiful colors and oxidation parts. Like the way they work together in those vases, like the slow burn is like the most beautiful, wonderful results that I've ever gotten. So I try really hard for that. I also tend to fire in the wintertime, which is terrifying from a potter's point of view because, cold, but it makes my neighbors not hate me as much because they're not outside. If I try to fire in the summertime and I've got this thing smoldering for days and people are trying to enjoy barbecues and stuff, I used to have people call the fire department on me and all the things, but I was obeying the laws. So it had a lid, it was far from my house, it was fine. But just to not be rude, I started firing in the winter. So you're not wrong about that cleanliness and the imposition that my firing methods might make on others, unwitting participants, if you will, my process. So it's really very much a thing.
Are you doing this in metal trash cans? Like, what's the container?
I do. I like to use oil drums. Those are a good size with a couple of air holes drilled in, depending. Some of them have big air holes. Some of them have very fine air holes. I have one that has it's like a downdraft smoke kiln, pretty fun, that I made. When I was at school, I also built out of our leftover kiln bricks, made a little smoke fire kiln. I didn't really like it as much, like too much air in, but it burned pretty quickly and pretty well. So yeah, I use lots of different kinds of things. But the drum is probably my favorite. Some people use galvanized steel garbage cans, but for some reason, I've never really had a lot of success with them. I feel like they crowd the piece too much. They don't have enough space around it to really let the airflow and the magic happen. They often put themselves out I don't know why, but it happens. There's lots of ways you can do it. I mean, you can do it in a barbecue if you want. Lots of people do. Just those are the ones that I tend to use because I really like them.
I know you've spent some time in New Mexico and that you've worked with Virgil Ortiz.
I've not quite worked with him.
Okay.
I'm obsessed with him. I love you, Virgil. If you're listening, you're my favorite. I have worked with Indigenous potters in New Mexico, but Virgil wasn't one of them. I did go and see him dance on feast day, though, in a very, very normal and not stalkery way.
Well, I've asked him about his firing process. And I mean, they're doing, well, for one, he makes amazing work, like just so freaking
Amazing
beautiful.
work.
And then I asked him to describe the firing, like how do you actually fire? And the firing is such a loose arrangement of pots that are then covered with the wood source and then more sort of, not shards, but like pieces of other ceramic that then become the kiln itself. And I was asking him like, well, how do you control for wind? And he's like, oh no, we don't fire if it's windy. Like you can't fire if it's windy because too much air, like what we're talking about here, too much primary air, that specific spot heats up too fast. And then there's ramifications for the pots, but it also, you're not going to get that necessarily like slow reduced black that you get with 55-gallon drum like you're talking about. So it's interesting how you're negotiating with nature in an interesting way when you fire like this.
You can't ignore the circumstances around you at all. And you do not want to have your pot heat up on one side more than the other, because then your pot's going to just explode. Pots. Nobody likes dead pots. So yeah, you do have to try and control for that. Again, I think that's why the drum is so awesome, because it's still affected by wind for the airflow blowing through it, but it's much reduced. So I feel like it's a safer bet. But doing traditional firings, I had so much fun during the summertime doing traditional firings at school with wood and firing pots and just doing demos for students so that they can see how this was done. Not thinking for a second that I shouldn't be doing this on hard concrete. I should be doing this on sand. Fun fact, concrete explodes when it sure does. So I think my studio tech is still not speaking to me about, it's just we have moist ground. So I couldn't just do it on the regular ground. But you really do have to pay attention, and there's a lot of skill that goes into it. I am not super skilled at full traditional firing thing. I am not that skilled at it. It will take me a long time to get good. But the people that are good, fantastic. You know those stories you hear about like the old Japanese guy who looks in the anagama and can tell how hot it is by like how white it is. He's like, oh, it's 3 hours, it'll be done. That's what they're like. They just know from doing it for so long and having such familiarity with all of the things and all of the variables. They're just amazingly good at it. And I am not there yet. Someday.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Bray Epoxy, a 2-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Bray Epoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Well, I wanted to contrast that style of firing and then the style you developed with what you saw people in South Africa. I know that you've spent time down there studying and also teaching. That was Zulu potters, right?
Yes, I was working almost entirely with Zulu potters. I was actually first there as a research assistant for an archaeologist who was studying Zulu potters. So,
what's the firing style there? Like, how does that compare to these others?
They use very, very different materials. The area that I was in, they most often did black firings of their beer vessels. You probably have seen them if you've seen this. They're fantastic. But they do it in like 2 stages. So they use dried aloe. Aloes get really big out there, huge. They use dried aloe as their first level of fuel. So they get the fire started in the middle, have the pots around, get them closer and closer. Finally, once the pots are warm, they put them in that sort of cinders, I guess, at that point, because it's burned down so much. Then they layer more aloe, dried aloe around it, pot shards. And then once it's really getting going, they use dried cow patties over the whole thing, or horse sometimes works too, but cows are more plentiful, as the reduction atmosphere that gets in there, and it totally carbon blacks everything. It's great. And they're fast. like 2 hours. You're in, you're out.
Does the clay have mica? Like how does the clay withstand that?
I didn't notice any mica when I was there. There's a ton in New Mexico. I noticed that. And like that mica, oh, it's so pretty. I've actually thought about adding it to my pots in order to help with the thermal shock, but I didn't notice it there. I have no idea. They're just magic, I guess. I don't. These were old ladies that were usually in their 70s or 80s who went on to land they weren't supposed to with like a shovel and a pick and a bag and just like filled these bags up of clay and then would walk for hours across the savannah with this clay and just from random places that they knew about in the area. Could not point to any of them ever. I would never be able to find them again. I have no idea what's in the clay. I didn't really do any testing of it. I don't think that was part of their research at the time, but now I kind of wish I did.
Your undergrad was anthropology, is that right?
No, but yes.
Okay.
I have a minor in anthropology. I really, really, really wanted to be an artist. I thought that was important, but I couldn't find out about pottery of people who lived where I lived. There's nobody to teach it, no one who knew anything about it. So the only way I can find out anything about any of the pottery of any of the people that I actually was interested in learning about was going through the archaeology and anthropology department. So you gotta do what you gotta do.
Yeah. What do you think that you learned from the lens of anthropology and archaeology looking at contemporary ceramics? Like, how does that inform the way you look at your own work and others?
Anthropology is very complicated and they're going through a lot of stuff right now. There is like this inherent patriarchalness or just way of looking at other cultures within anthropology that was like built in from when it started. It's very colonial. It's very look at these quaint people doing these backward things in such a funny way. We should take pictures. Like you're working really hard on not being like that, but it's kind of like the RCMP, which was deliberately made to go and catch Indians. Like there's going to be an undercurrent of that in it. Like it needs full restructuring, and that's what they're working on right now. But I really reinforce the idea of who is allowed to make capital A art and who is not allowed to make capital A art. Right. It's not art, it's artifacts, right? Brown people don't make art, they make artifacts. They go in museums. White people make stuff for art galleries. So it keeps coming back to that. I'm sorry. But
No, it's a good thing to think about is classification, and a lot of times the person doing the classifying, I mean, I learned this in a cultural anthropology class, is that there's no way you can not have bias.
mm-hmm.
You have bias. So knowing that you have bias, if you're looking at another culture, don't classify. I mean, I went to school in the late 90s, so it was not, there was no great revelation at that point in the broader anthropological studies sense.
Agreed.
And what they basically said is just essentially like categorization is power. So you just need to reckon with that. There was no solution given to like how you do it correctly. It was more just like, this is a thing. But I think that that's interesting. Folks that study anthropology, I notice, look at material different than, say, someone that is just trained, like a painter trained in an art school. So I think that whole material is meaning thing, which is big in the big A art world, is like, well, of course it is. Like this is anyone in anthropology or in anything craft related has always kind of understood that, I think.
It's a fun one. It's a fun thing to think through. And I do love the idea of learning about different cultures. But I always thought it was really strange how it's so frowned upon for you to do any anthropological studies of your own culture. Right? Like that was never, it's a thing you can do now. Like one of the people I met in New Mexico is Mary Wiaki, who's a Comanche archaeologist. And she likes to study She likes to study ancient weapons, but it just, it just wasn't really a thing that I'd ever heard of growing up, of somebody going to school to be able to study the history of their own peoples or the prehistory of their own peoples. It was frowned upon. Very true it was, but it doesn't seem to be the case now. So I think it's a whole changing landscape of the way that we interpret ourselves, interpret our relationships to others. And yeah, I think it also helps us have a better vocabulary for talking to each other about where we come from.
Well, speaking of vocabulary, this is a great segue into this idea. I've heard you talk about this in another talk that you did about the difference between cultural transmission, like information being passed from person to person, versus cultural appropriation, where generally that's not a dialogue. That is one person copying or stealing, or some type of theft is happening. But I think can be a real blurry line for an 18-year-old that doesn't necessarily know one from the other. So in your teaching and in your making, how do you distinguish between the two?
I often talk to students about how when I teach them things, what I'm teaching them is technique. So I'm showing them step A, step B, step C, and this is how you make a pot. All of those things are fair use. Every single one, like nobody invented coiling. Nobody owns burnishing a pot. Nobody owns any of those things. But when we start talking about the iconography on pots, or the design grammar, if you will, or the specific designs that belong to families or peoples, that's not ours. That's not ours to play with. So we cannot use those. We can replace them with our own, and that makes it now your pot, right? It's like I had a friend who took this class where she was learning to make ongi. Cool. And she was taking it from a Korean teacher. And she's like, yeah, like I'm making Korean ongi. I'm like, you're making ongi. It's like, well, no, I'm making Korean ongi. Are we in Korea? Because we're not. You're making a Korean style ongi in Canada. That's what we're doing. Like, you can make something that's definitely related to, and you can make something that's definitely inspired by. You can make something that's definitely like using techniques by, but it's not the same thing as making somebody from that particular group making that thing. You're making something that's inspired by it or referencing it. You're not making it. Yeah. So there is a distinction, and I know it's a hard one. Mostly I think that people just need to be very open to having the conversation about it if it comes up. And I feel like that's the hardest part, actually, is when somebody does make a claim or opens up the discussion. A lot of people feel really attacked by it and then shut down. And that's not really getting anywhere. That's not helping anything. That's not, building conversation. That's not making cultural understanding. It's not doing any of those things. At the same time, if somebody is doing something that is questionably stealing, asking them about it, talk about it. Like, okay, why was doing this exact thing this exact way important? Maybe there's a very good reason why it is the way it is. Maybe that's what they're talking about in their work. I don't know. I'm not going to know until I ask, right? Until we have that conversation. I can't just assume that they're doing something, I don't know, steely or appropriating. I cannot assume that. There might be a very specific, good reason for why it's happening that way. Or they might just not know that that's not an appropriate symbol to use. Yeah. So it is hard. It is a hard one. I mean, I'm not New Mexican. I'm not South African, but I spent a lot of time learning pottery techniques in those places. And I will teach those pottery techniques to literally anybody who wants to hang out with me for 5 minutes. But there's aspects of those traditions that I know, but I would never share. because they're not mine to share, right? Yeah, it's a difficult thing because all cultures steal from each other. That's why we have like amazing pizza right now, right? Otherwise, that's why we just borrow things and we incorporate it into new ways of being, and that's just what humans do. Um, I think it's more about being able to give proper acknowledgement, I think, is the thing that really is the most upsetting, is when somebody borrows something and doesn't acknowledge that this is where I was getting this from. This is where I learned this. This is how I brought this to the fore. Yeah, when you, like, I use a lot of weaving with my pots. And people are like, that's so amazing. I've never heard of this before. Like, I've never heard of this. I did not invent this. This has been done everywhere for 80 billion years. It's people on the West Coast do it with pine needles. People in Africa do it with tall grasses. People on the East Coast do it with sweetgrass or tall grass. Like, it is ubiquitous. It is not an invention. And I'm not sure why more people don't do it. Probably because you can't put coffee in a woven. But again, I did not invent this. And people often are like, oh, I've never seen this before. It's really actually quite common. Here are 19 examples of people that are doing it right now. Just making sure that people are aware that there's almost nothing new in clay. Like, it's been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's literally what helped us become a technological society. And yeah, different variations. And we're always learning and growing and adapting and refining. But essentially, we're still playing in the mud, just like we were 10,000 years ago. So of us have just gotten really uppity about it.
We've gotten fancy over time.
Yeah, we're fancy now. We're very fancy now. But essentially, we all like are grown adults that play in dirt, and we love it.
So I wanted to end talking about the work that you do with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Well, first, can you explain what that is and then what you do with the center?
The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is based on one of the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, who did a 5-year study to try and figure out some of the best ways that the Canadian people can reconcile with Indigenous people. And one of the recommendations was to build the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which would house all of the archives and all of the records of all of the residential school children who attended residential school, which schools there were, the ones that disappeared, we never heard from, any information that we find about ones that we haven't been able to locate. Like we have a lot of unmarked graves that have been uncovered in the last few years. Basically, we're the repository for all of that information that has been mandated by the Canadian government to exist forever, so that this information will never be lost, in the hopes that it will never be repeated. So that's where I work. And mostly what I do at the moment is I work with elders and communities on trying to find best practices for informing families about how they would like to receive information if and when we find one of their lost children. So this has happened through research. They have been finding information about kids that just disappeared, and sometimes they ended up in Indian hospitals with tuberculosis, or moved away to the States and just never came back, and whatever. So we do have some of these records about what happened, but a lot of the families, they just disappeared, and nobody ever heard from them again. Never knew what happened. No one informed them. Nothing. So now that we are doing extensive research into what happened to those children, we now have some answers for people. Yeah, and my job is to find out how best to actually share that information. It just doesn't seem reasonable for us to just show up on doorsteps without any notice. So yeah, that's what I do. I go from community to community in Canada, talking to elders, trying to find out what they would prefer.
When was the last active residential school?
I suppose it depends on your definition. The consensus definition that we go with is 1997.
Oh my God.
I know.
I was going to ask a question about distant versus current history, but that is current.
Within our own lifetime. Like, bananas how recent that was.
Oh my
Indeed.
God.
Yeah.
Because this has been in the American news because of the discovery of mass graves. In the U.S., there's not an exact equivalent, even though that there was a system of schooling that was similar.
Boarding schools.
Exactly, was similar. But my connection to this is Americans denying the racist history of America. This type of thing for Canada makes it so that there can't be a deny. I mean, people can deny it, but there is an archive where this information is kept. So that counterbalances the denial of this happening. How do you think the keeping of information keeps these things from happening again, or at least makes it so people can't be in denial that they happened the first time?
There's always going to be deniers. It doesn't matter. They did the exact same thing after the Holocaust. They took photos, they took videos, they got first-person stories. They did everything they could because they knew that there were always going to be people who would deny it. And now here we are, and there's a lot of Holocaust deniers to this day. So there's no real way that we can make sure that people won't deny that it happened. All we can really do is make sure that the records that we have that show how the conditions that the children were living in, or how much harm was actually caused by their experiences, can be preserved. So many generations will be able to see it, and they'll be able to know and understand those experiences. But we can never, ever really stop the deniers. They just are. Yeah, they get more vehement the more proof you show them. The whole thing.
It's interesting that facts don't solve cognitive dissonance.
It really doesn't. I really wish that it did. I really, really do. Because again, I go to parties and people want to have debates with me about stuff. Yeah, it's a rough one. You can pull out all the facts you want. You can pull out dates, numbers, photos, pictures, videos. Doesn't matter. It does not matter what you back it up with. Doesn't matter what your sources are. Does not matter. They just choose to not believe something horrible.
Working in a center like this, like the idea of archiving as being an important part of establishing a cultural legacy is something I think a lot about in ceramics. In a way, this podcast has become that for me. You know, like I feel like I'm trying to track the ceramic community in a way. But how do you think the ceramic community can benefit from just archiving, conscious remembering of elders' knowledge, like these types of things? Do you have any general thoughts on that?
There are some spectacular people in the U.S. who have collections. I was just recently, a couple of years ago, talking to Winnie Owens Hart. She's just amazing. Has this collection of African-American ceramics, like absolutely unknown outside of her collection, like hundreds of artists that nobody's ever heard of. No one's ever seen their work. And, you know, she's right now cataloging them. She's writing about them. She's doing all of this work. And it just is super bananas because I've just recently heard somebody say, oh, well, there didn't used to be black potters in like the 1970s. Like, well, we only just found them now. I don't know if that's accurate, actually.
Yeah.
Because they exist, right? Just because we don't know about them doesn't mean that they're not there. So that kind of information, these stories that she's collected through these pots, like, they're mind-blowingly important. There are huge histories in collections that people have right now. And I kind of wonder what happens to those collections intergenerationally. Like, what happens with them? Just imagining if I died right now my sister would be in charge of deciding what happens to my pots. And like, she's a dental hygienist, okay? She has no idea the kind of pots that I have or which ones are important and which are valuable. So I really wonder how we are going to continue to hold on to these collections that people have spent their whole lives putting together of these absolutely significant, but maybe unknown artists who have been coiling away in obscurity for the win. And just doing really great work that we're not going to realize how important it is until later, which seems to happen with artists a lot. But having that, being able to document it, being able to find out the stories, the techniques, the ways or why they made things, like that is all very, very important to me. One of the things that I wanted to do when I first started at NCECA was to bring awareness of how many ceramic techniques are being lost all the time, just sort of through attrition. A lot of places around the world, their kids aren't going into the family business anymore. They're not making the pots anymore. They're going to universities. They're being engineers, all of which is wonderful. But once grandma passes or grandpa passes, that information's just gone forever. So there's thousands of potters who have very unique specialized knowledge that just goes with them when they're gone. They didn't write a book. They didn't keep track. So it's just gone. And that makes me like so sad. I do what I can to try and encourage people to buy pots. Buy pots from people that aren't necessarily famous, like the roadside potter or whatever's. Go visit the roadside potter when you're in Venezuela and the person who's selling the gourd pots. Buy those, because if you're not giving them money for the pots, there's no reason for them to continue. If it's not an economically viable way of making money, they're not going to do it. They're going to make more money working in a call center or whatever than they ever will making pots. So yeah, just do your best. Buy everything you can.
To wrap up, can you leave your social media and website so people could get in touch?
Sure. I'm at pjanderson.com for my website. For Insta, I'm at PJ Anderson Ceramics.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's nice to talk.
I'd like to thank PJ for coming on the show and also for the excellent work that she does as the programs director for NCECA. If you're going to be at this year's NCECA, we are going to be having live tapings in the podcast room, so come on out and be a part of that process. If you would also like to listen to the NCECA 360 podcast, PJ has lent her voice to do one of the intros for an episode, and we would love to have you listen for that. You can find that on all major podcast apps, and you can also find it at nceca.net/podcast. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and the Archie Bray Foundation. If your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor, we do need support in 2025, so get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.